And I would invite John to make the first presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Welcome everyone again back for the second day of the meeting. So today I want to give you an overview of what I think is a comprehensive framework to monitor and quantify fiscal risks. Now, why do we need such a framework? Okay, our offices, ministries, big organizations have tools to be able to understand how risk evolve. But I think there is a sense in which there are certain what we call tail risks, or maybe in a different language, catastrophic events that are very difficult to forecast. Therefore, we want a framework that is able to capture those eventualities as well. So, okay, let's start with some motivation. Fiscal risks are, especially in the area that we live in, are potentially infinite and you know, to some extent difficult to identify, let alone measure. So, you know, we have experienced certain events in the last 15 years, especially since the outbreak of the great financial crisis, and different types of events can trigger simultaneously several risks that can in turn generate a shock to public finances. Now, the critical element here is that the distribution of risks may not be symmetric. Okay, so you know, think of the COVID pandemic. It was clearly what we would call a tail risk, maybe not even a tail risk, because it was out of the distribution of potential outcomes that may occur before we observe anything. So it's important to be able to have a framework to capture those tail risks. And in the era of more complexity and more fiscal risks stemming from different factors, while at the same time we want to be fiscal prudent, we need such an approach. And any sound fiscal approach should cover all the potential significant changes to public finances. And to steal a quote, if you don't mind me, the colleagues from OBR here, the approach that requires a policy response before or after the event, we want to be able to kind of have some useful framework to give us some time to respond, so that we can build fiscal buffers. Now, before we can do anything about fiscal risk, classify them, measure them, etc., we need to have a forecast. Okay, so the first core element of this approach is to generate some sort of a forecast. Now, where could significant deviations in public in the forecast can come from? And here I'm going to use the OECD recommendation of the Council on Budgetary Governance that recommends to countries to classify risks according to type. So you can have standard macro risks, you know, stemming from cyclical factors, unanticipated tax losses, or even tax gains, unanticipated changes in spending that are related to the cyclical factors in the economy. You can have government policy and program risks, spending disruptions stemming from, let's say, a natural catastrophe that may occur due to the consequences of climate change. Contingent liabilities risks. Okay, we know we've been discussing about the implications of pensions and healthcare costs. Balance sheet risks stemming from the re-evaluation of assets and liabilities that the government is holding. And finally, what are called, according to OECD, debt risks. And again, here we think of interest rate or foreign exchange risks that have consequences for the servicing cost of debt, for example. Okay, so variations in interest rates that could throw you away from some prediction about your servicing cost. So the goal here is to develop this framework that can monitor and quantify these fiscal risks, certain categories of fiscal risks anyway, based on the magnitude and probability of occurring, and measuring the potential impact on key fiscal variables. And this framework can also allow for, again, borrowing from the bank stress test for fiscal stress testing and scenario analysis, so that we can inform the build-up of fiscal buffers. This could be helpful, for example, when you are able to understand how certain variables will move when they all go in one direction, say in the left tail of the distribution or in the right tail of the distribution. All right, so this is the framework. It's a very simple framework. I'm going to give you some intuition how this works, and then I'm going to show you, regrettably, some equations, but they are very simple equations and very easy to apply. So suppose you want to forecast a variable y. This can be one variable, can be a vector of variables, using many predictors. So suppose your priors are that this variable can be jointly explained by a variety of predictors. These predictors can be in the order of 100, 200, 700, even in the thousands. In step one, this is essentially a three-step approach. Each step involves a very simple OLS regression, ordinary least squares. So you don't need to know any fancy state-of-the-art econometrics to run with this. The first step, selectively identify the factor from a very large number of potential predictors. So your factor is your summary indicator that captures all the covariances in those predictors. But these covariances are also relevant for explaining the variation in your y. So you're trying to, in some sense, select those predictors that give you the maximum covariance between those predictors and your variable that you're trying to forecast, your y. In the second step, you compute this latent factor. So it's latent because it's unobserved. And this factor summarizes the most relevant information from your data. And in the third step, you forecast y based on an autoregressive, very simple autoregressive framework. Again, it could be univariate, it could be multivariate. Now, you can have, and I will show you some extensions. I will describe them in a moment. You can have several factors. It's not just one factor yet that you need. Today, I'm going to only focus on one factor because it's important for for our mandates in some sense. Okay, so this is the music, essentially. So the three regressions. So the first regression, essentially, again, like I said, it's an OLS regression. The first regression maps the cross-sectional distribution of the predictors onto this variable called z. This z is your forecast target. So suppose you want to predict GDP growth. This right-hand side variable is GDP growth. Suppose you want to predict, as I will do here, forecast the fiscal balance as a share of GDP. My z will be this variable here on this first step. So I'm going to run this OLS. So it's a it's a time series regression for each predictor. So if I have 100 predictors, I'm going to run 100 OLS estimations. I'm going to get these PHIs, the slope estimates. I'm going to keep this. I'm going to go to the second step. So this first step, essentially, using this forecast target, this is the critical step in this method. It's using this forecast target to discipline the dimension reduction from your predictors to the variable you are interested in forecasting. What this means is that it means that it will drop any irrelevant information. Suppose you throw in 300 variables, half of them are completely relevant for your Y. They don't explain none of the variation in Y. The fees you're going to get from that will be zero. So it will throw away all irrelevant information in this first step. Then you go on to the second step, and you run a cross-section regression of again your predictors, but this time you run it on a time series sense for each t. You're going to take the PHIs as your regressors this time, and this regression, the second regression, again using estimated by OLS, will give you this F capital T, and this is your summary indicator. This is the factor that you're going to be using to forecast your Y. And finally, in the third step, you will estimate another time series regression. Say your Y, you want to do 1 quarter ahead, 1 month ahead, 1 year ahead, whatever you want your forecast horizon to be on this predictive factor or factors. Again, this is very, very versatile and very general. You can have several factors on the right-hand side of this regression. The only thing you need to do is to add more z's on the first step. And those z's can actually come from some model you have in your mind, some theoretical model, for example. It's not necessarily some crazy idea that you have. So this optimal forecast comes essentially from these truly relevant factors for forecasting your variable of interest, the Y. Okay? Right. So, advantages of this framework. Very simple estimation, Mickey Mouse OLS, nothing fancy, nothing is required in terms of computing power. You can run this whole thing in seconds, even with several hundred predictor variables. You can add more variables if you like. Like I said, the method itself will throw away the irrelevant information. So fast computation, reliable, replicable results. The framework can be extended to allow for multiple structural breaks, different types of macroeconomic risks, and large data sets. And you can also, I will give you some on my final slide, some other ideas about that. And most importantly, this first step pass or step, the first step regression that I've shown you, it is a supervised framework. So those factors are estimated with reference to the target variable. So you maximize the covariance between your target variable and your predictors, essentially. Now, why is this better than some other framework that you might be using? For example, principal component analysis framework. These frameworks are usually unsupervised, so you throw in you have lots of predictor variables. You get a principal component, and you try to use this as a forecast. But this has no interpretation. How do you know what is factor or summary indicator that you come up with is? With this framework, you know what the summary indicator refers to. So I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to be more specific about that. Right, so I have some notes here which I will skip. Okay, I mean, you may be using partial squares, you may be using simple AR1, you may be using vector autoregressive, factor, augmented vector autoregressive, etc., etc. Right, so let me go with an illustrative example. So this is technically not an application, it's just an example. I didn't want to pick out any specific country, so I've used the EU aggregate data, Euro area to be precise, aggregate data. But obviously, you can try this at your institution. You can use your country's information. So I've taken quarterly data from 2001 to 2022. Used a large cross-section of potential predictors. So in this example, I have 120 variables. These are, so I didn't want to bore you with a list, but they are, they're standard macro variables: unemployment, GDP growth, inflation. So there's a macro block, there's a financial markets block. So there's several interest rates here, both corporate and consumer borrowing rates, government bond rates, short and long, some forward-looking variables like confidence, sentiment indicators, and a government block. So we've taken the items from the expenditure and revenues, the different items that Eurostat provides. And the forecast target, so my Y here is the euro area fiscal balance as a share of GDP. Okay? So the first graph I'm going to show you just now is a plot of that fiscal balance, the actual data, vis-a-vis the factor that is estimated, this one factor that is estimated from this framework. Now, let me give you a warning. This factor, this plot I'm going to show you, the factor is meaningless in terms of the actual number, because it's the variables are standardized. Now, what I want to show you here is, with this framework, I can interpret this red line as, in search of a better name, and you can help me with that, as a fiscal conditions index. Okay, because my target variable is the fiscal balance as a share of GDP. If I had another target variable, say GDP growth, that could be overall economic conditions index. So I'm going to call this, for this presentation, a fiscal conditions index. Now, what you can notice from this graph, so blue line is the actual data, red line is that factor, the fiscal conditions index. Qualitatively, it captures the turning points quite well. Okay, so if you look at the period just before the great financial crisis, which here begins around the mid of 2007. Again, recall this is a quarterly data, right? So there is some time aggregation going on here, but you can see the red line is capturing this turning point quite well with respect to the actual data. It does well as well in the last in the collapse of the worsening of the fiscal deficit during the COVID era. So it has this this downward movement, sharp downward movement in the middle of 2019. Now, again, like I said, this is qualitatively only, okay? So you can't say anything about forecasting here or nowcasting, but what you can do in the next slide I'm going to show you is you can see, okay, Okay, so you can see an example fit of this. So here I'm taking the factor, and I'm doing a pseudo nowcasting. I mean, it's not really nowcasting because I'm using quarterly data. It doesn't really make much sense to do nowcasting with quarterly data and without real time and vintages, etc., etc. But just to see the fit of this framework vis-a-vis the actual data. Okay, and still this is not a forecast. Okay, we'll come to that shortly. So again, you can see now this red line has a meaning in terms of units. So now this line says that, you know, in 2000 and let's say 9 Q1, the actual deficit is about 3.8%. It predicts something about 3.6%. Again, I'm slightly abusing the language, okay, so of prediction and. Okay, so this is something that you need to always check, even when you're forecasting. You know, you stop the sample at some point, you do any sample fit, you see how well your factor fits the data. Obviously, here if I were to compute an R squared, that would be over 90%. Right. So zooming into the Great Recession period after the financial crisis, the global financial crisis. So this is what it looks like. So again, you can see it does capture well the turning points, both on the downside and on the upside. Okay, so here's the most difficult graph, which is an actual forecast. So now I'm estimating this with data up to 2014 Q4, and I'm doing a recursive forecast, 1 quarter recursive forecast for every quarter, and I'm adding the information back into the data. So when I finish the forecast in 2015 Q1, I'm adding this as a data point for the next forecast. Right, and this is what, so regrettably, I'm going to have to start from 2015 Q1, which is a very benign period in terms of fiscal finances. These, what do you call this color? No, the color of the bands. So you see the bands, so these are probability bands, 95 probability bands. I'm just, yeah, the gray.
The color.
No, the color of the confidence interval. I'm just trying to get the color right.
Purple.
Okay, let's go with purple. Yeah, okay. Right, so you see the confidence intervals. These are 95% confidence intervals. Okay, so up to, let's see what quarter is this, up to 2019 Q4, you know, your out of sample forecast, you know, is pretty much flat, if you like, okay? Because the model learns from the past. What does it learn? It learns that the fiscal balance is flat, so it's going to give you a flat prediction. Okay, nothing strange about that. The black line is the data. So this one here will be late in terms of forecasting that collapse. I mean, no surprise there. I don't know of a model that could predict the collapse of the COVID-19 pandemic fiscal balances. Although I think there's a way to improve on this, and I will explain how to do that. So it kind of misses the big collapse there, But nevertheless, it gives you an indication that, you know, I mean, it's moving in the right direction, right? So it's, for example, here, it actually overpredicts that you're going to be in a worse position than the actual deficit when the deficit has begun recovering. Then after the model understands that there is a recovery, you start forecasting upwards again. And, you know, when things get a little bit smoother, the confidence bands here contain your actual data. Okay, so this is, I think, and you know, you are the judges of this. This is incredibly useful to have as a framework to kind of start organizing our thoughts about, you know, what could go wrong, for example. How can we forecast in a very simple way, reducing the complexity, but keep the essential information in our toolkit. Now, what you can do with this thing, right, I have a table here which I'm not going to bore you with because it's, I don't even want to explain this, but what I want you to take from this is in terms of forecasting performance, so I'm using two measures here, mean absolute error and root mean square error. And in terms of performance, this specific framework dominates, you know, even the most, you know, anything basically that we have thrown in here. And, you know, I'm happy to take suggestions of, you know, throwing in other models as well. So in the multivariate case, for example, we take as a benchmark a vector autoregressive framework with two variables. So your relative mean square error is 1, obviously in this case. So this TVP, so you see this factor, the factor 1 that I've shown you is as good as that. If I start putting in, if I start adding time varying loadings and quantile factors, I do even better than this. What I've shown you here is what we call a mean factor. So this captures in an average sense, the variation in your predictors. But with this framework, you can estimate a quantile factor. So you're trying to get when some of your variables, not all of your variables, are moving into the tails of the distribution, you can estimate a quantile factor. Say you're interested, so when I was talking about fiscal stress and scenario analysis, this is what you can do with this. So you want to get a sense of when certain subset of your variables are moving in that direction, in the tail of the distribution, essentially the left tail, that would mean that your fiscal balance is deteriorating, then you can capture this very well. And so in this case, if I were to have a forecast with a quantile factor, let's say the 10th lowest quantile factor, this forecast here will be shifted downwards. So it will give me an even more pronounced deterioration of the deficit. Right, I'm going to go back to this if I have time. It depends on the chair. Almost. Yeah. Okay, I'm not gonna show you that. Right. So.
John, it's okay.
Oh yeah.
No.
We're so far away, we can't speak.
Let's try to get to the questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me summarize. This is my last slide. So I think what we can do with these things, and we are developing this right now. This will be extremely useful to do nowcasting with real-time data and mixed frequency data. So suppose you can have daily, weekly, monthly, and you can do, if you want to forecast the quarterly headline figure for the fiscal balance, you can do with this approach, and you can do a nowcasting. you can allow for time varying loadings, which will capture how the different risks are moving in the sample. Like I said, estimates only the quantile factors. Okay, gets more and more technical, but again, remember all of this within this three-step OLS framework. There's nothing difficult about this. So we are developing a dashboard programmed in R, which we will make hopefully publicly available soon, and you can try it out. And so you can start performing scenario analysis and fiscal stress testing, and be interested to hear your feedback. Right, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, John. Now I would ask delegates to raise your placards, and I'll call in the order that I see, as close to the order that you raise them as possible. Okay. So Portugal, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on what is the new information your predictor has that is not present in the past data used to compute that regressor? Because when you have shown us the, I think it was figure 3, the forecasting results, I was not completely convinced about the ability of that predictor to capture shock like COVID, whose emergence was not on the stars before. So no matter how many hundred variables you have used in the first step to compute the final predictor, I mean, it seems that the framework could not invent or imagine that such a shock was coming out. So basically, it seems that you use only autoregressive information to predict the future. So basically, the predictor appeared to me as a sort of sophisticated predictor, but based on past data and not new data. How do you react to this comment?
Okay, right. So thanks for this. So the quality of the forecast depends on the quality of your input, right? Now, the new information that can be captured here is by throwing in forward-looking variables. Now, we don't have that many forward-looking variables here. And in terms of this forecasting COVID era, I don't know any model that can predict, that can forecast out of sample the COVID shock. So this is not a proposition that we can forecast the black swan. This is a proposition that you can measure, you can quantify how much, you know, give you a neighborhood of how deep your fiscal hole might be with some uncertainty. All these models have uncertainty behind it, right? But you can do better than what I've shown you here by doing nowcasting. And if you have, for example, more granular data, say suppose you had, you throw in, since you raised COVID, suppose you throw in hospitalization rates, which were, available, I'm not sure if daily, but certainly weekly. You can do much better because then you can do a nowcasting exercise. So you can say, okay, let me use all the available data up to March and try and forecast what's going to happen by the end of the quarter, right? By June or yes, the second quarter, for example. So I've actually looked at the IMF's global economic outlook publication in, I think it was May or June 2020, if I remember correctly. It was certainly further off than what this framework implies in terms of the fiscal balance. So this what I'm suggesting is that this predicts better than what's inside the IMF economic outlook. But again, I will go back to my first response. The quality of the forecast depends on how granular you can be with your data and whether you can actually have enough information, advanced information about how certain things are moving. Here is all these variables, the predictors that I'm throwing in are very standard, right? So there's nothing, there's no, there are things that we can use, additional information, extra information we can use to inform this framework.
Thank you very much. Italy, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I just would like to understand better what is inside this factor one that you presented. You said that you could say, with respect to a principal component analysis, that in factor one you have more, let's say, information. What is inside this factor one? Thank you.
Right, so I didn't have time to solve this. So remember in the first step, you estimate these loadings, right? So these loadings essentially map your predictors to the factor. So you can plot these loadings, and you can check what predictors are loading onto this factor. These loadings can vary over time. In this specific example that I've shown you, there is, and you can actually group your predictors. You can use the OECD classification. You can group your predictors like this, and you can take the loadings. Right, so you can create a table with the loadings and see, okay, my GDP growth is loading with 10%. My interest expenditure on from debt is loading with 15%. Some variables can, like I said, they can be completely irrelevant. So the loading can be zero. And the nice thing about this is that you can actually estimate these time varying loadings. So because certain variables will be much better in forecasting your Y in different time periods, right? But you can all of this is information that can be supplied by this framework. There's nothing, everything is transparent. You can get all the outputs from this framework, the loadings, how they vary, etc., etc.
Okay, so our last two questions, it's going to be first from the EU IFIs and then Belgium. I would ask that you each ask your questions and then John respond to both. So
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Yes, from what you showed us, figure 4, my understanding is that the uncertainty around this forecast is increasing after COVID. I don't know if I was wondering how it can be captured, because this is basically the issue now for the forecast that is like really associated with high uncertainty. Yeah.
Belgium?
Thank you for the presentation. A question, usually you want to forecast more than one variable, the fiscal one, the macro scenario, and you have your discretionary measures. So I wonder how in this framework you ensure consistency between the different variables that you want to forecast.
Okay. I'm not sure I've understood completely your question. So the uncertainty after the COVID comes from the fact that you have a very smooth, stable period, right?